Hello, everyone. This is your Professor Adam Dunstan. It's really good to be with you today. We are going to talk today about Inupiat and St. Lawrence Island Yupik culture, and also the broader Inuit tradition within which Inupiat falls. And I've subtitled this Life at the Top of the World because indeed we are talking about groups of people living in the far northern parts of Alaska, in the shores of Bering Sea. So this is a fun lecture, and I hope you like it. I find Inupiat culture and St. Lawrence Island Yupik culture both really, really, really interesting. And what we'll be doing today is really just scratching the surface, but I hope to share a few things that will pique your interest and hopefully allow you to keep learning more about both traditions in your future. So, Kaimarutin, welcome. I've forgive my poor Inupiat. It is not strong at all. But today we are talking about, again, Inupiat and St. Lawrence Island Yupik. So this big kind of, map that we've seen before of the five different main culture areas or culture groups, kind of clusters of similar cultures. This is the one that we're talking about this week. So the one in dark blue right here. Linguistically, close relatives, or at least same language family as Yupik and Chupik, and then also of Sugpiaq and Unangan. This is all one big language family, and indeed, the Inupiaq is part of Inuit kind of language spectrum, which goes all the way over to Greenland and through Canada. So predominantly today, then here and here. Um, you'll notice that there's also these groups over here, and you're like, what's going on there? If it's a map of Alaska Native cultures, why do we have some groups over in Siberia? And we will get there, but we're not going to get there yet. First, we are going to talk about Inupiat. So Inupiat, and then I said slash Inuit. And the reason why is that Inupiat is the name that we typically use for people who are part of the sort of broader culture or language tradition that we call Inuit. But there are different names for different Inuit kind of branches across the Arctic. So Inuit kind of covers, northern Alaska, all the way through northern parts of Canada, Nunavut, and then into Greenland. And so here in Alaska, Inuit people, traditionally in their own language, we say Inupiat, or Inupiaq for singular. And there are 34 villages that are communities that traditionally were Inupiat communities. And I say that I'm framing that as traditionally were because, of course, people, move into different villages, and might come from a variety of different backgrounds, but predominantly Inupiat villages, right? So there are 34 villages like that. Probably the one that people have most heard of, if they're not from that part of Alaska, is Utqiagvik, or as it used to be known, Barrow. But then also like Kotzebue, Point Hope, Wainwright, Inuktitut Pass, Shishmaref, Wales. So if you know of folks from any of those villages, there's a decent chance that those folks are Inupiat. So I have here a link to a video. I'll put these slides will be available to you on Blackboard, so you can go and look at that video on your own time. I'm not going to do a video of a video, both because technologically that often causes issues, and that also seems a little redundant for me to show you a video while I'm doing this video. But I would strongly recommend you go watch this video on your own. This is of King Island and Little Diomede dancers, so Inupiat dancers, and it's a really cool video. It's from Utqiagvik or Barrow, Alaska, and it's specifically as people were sort of there's been this like revitalization or revival of Messenger Feast, which is a specific major kind of like celebration and feast, and also a chance for people to trade and to interact with each other that was traditionally practiced across Inupiat communities. And it's called Messenger Feast because a messenger went from one community would go to another community and say like, hey, we're doing a messenger feast, we're doing a celebration, right? So it came to be called Messenger Feast because of the messenger that you send to invite your neighboring community over. It would have been something done in the winter. Messenger feasts traditionally were one of the many different ways in which winter could be a time of celebration and not just sort of like retreat in Inupiat communities, right? We often sort of like Alaskans nowadays, we often treat it as though you kind of have to like get through winter, like it's this difficult thing. But within Inupiat tradition, winter is in part a time to celebrate and a time to do dance and song and meet with your neighbors. And so that's Messenger Feast. And this is a good example of some traditional dances that come from Messenger Feast. So as I mentioned a second ago, Inuit is kind of a broader language of several dialects that stretches from the North Slope of Alaska through the northern parts of Yukon and Nunavut in Canada, and then into Greenland. So the vast majority of Greenlanders are Inuit and would be sort of very distant but cultural and language relatives of Inuit people over here in Alaska. So that's a remarkably broad geographic spread for a specific language. That's like huge. And so we'll get a little bit more into that later. But again, Inupiat is specifically for Inuit people living in Alaska. This is Inuit Nunat, sort of the broader Inupiat homeland, or Inuit homeland, sorry. Um, this is a kind of zoomed in maps showing way more of those villages that I mentioned before. You'll see that I mentioned several of them, but there's several that I didn't mention. Um, you'll see that I've, rather poorly drawn in here Dene. So basically that's kind of showing you the boundary where the villages on this side are, sort of majority Dene or Athabascan communities, and on this side, majority Inupiat communities. And so there's kind of this cultural border and boundary there. Not like a boundary, like a firm set boundary. Like obviously people interact with each other lots, and especially some of the more interior Inupiat communities traditionally, their lifeways and their practices looked similar in many ways to Dene or Athabascan communities. Like you had groups that were more whaling heavy on the coast, but then you did have groups out here in Inupiat communities like that traditionally were doing a lot of things that were really similar to Dene and Athabascan people, particularly like a heavy, heavy reliance on caribou hunting. So my point with all of that to say is, even though I drew a big red line here, don't assume that like people didn't interact because they clearly did, right? Like folks, you're 50 miles over, we're probably going to see each other every once in a while as we both hunt caribou in this broader forested area. And there's also evidence of people like trading back and forth and stuff like that that we'll see, or like a technology being developed in one area in the archaeological record, and then like, oh, now it's popping up over with Athabascan communities over here. So there's clearly sharing going on, even though these are two totally different language families. But how did sort of Inupiat people arrive into Alaska is, of course, a question that how you answer will depend on one's interpretive frame of reference. Archaeologists, by and large, um, subscribe to the theory of arrival from Siberia, and so specifically holding that there was, as we've talked about before, multiple waves of people moving into the Americas, and specifically, we've there kind of been a lot of different research to reevaluate if this was two waves or three waves or how we might conceptualize this. But I'm going to kind of present a simplified version of it that kind of represents the overall archaeological consensus, such to the extent that there is a consensus, which is that basically the people that eventually became Inupiat people, or the communities that eventually became Inupiat communities, I should say, really kind of started with Arctic small tool migration moving in about 5,000 years ago before present, or roughly 3,000 BC. Now, there were people in these areas previous to that, but they would have come from other groups such as Northern Archaic, and Paleoarctic. But as far as like a group of people that's more directly connected to later Inupiat communities, we have Arctic small tool tradition moving in around 5,000 BC. Um, and actually, it's a little more complicated than that because you eventually have a group called the Thule, and there's kind of a question of if that was yet another wave of migration. But for now, we're going to kind of start with the notion of Arctic small tool tradition as where we're starting the story. And you'll see that there's kind of we're going to go through some stages of the Denbigh Flint complex, and of course Norton and Iputak, Birnik, and Thule, and we'll talk about all that. So, Arctic small tool tradition kind of proliferates across northern Alaska and indeed across much of the Arctic about starting about 4,000 years ago. There's different versions of that in different parts of Alaska. In some of the Inupiat areas, though, you have something called Denbigh Flint complex, which is kind of a variant of this. Arctic small tool traditions are found across though this like huge, like they move into North America. You see this tool tradition pop up where okay, here's a bunch of artifacts that look like each other and they look really different than the stuff that came before. And as soon as they pop up, really, really quickly you see archaeological sites that match this type of tools all across the Arctic. So when you see something like that as an anthropologist, you ask yourself, well, does this mean a new group of people moved in and then migrated very, very quickly across the Arctic? Or does it mean that a new group of people came in, had a really cool set of technology, and other people that were neighboring were like, oh, cool set of technology, and like picked that up? Either way, eventually you have the Inuit cultural tradition that stretches across the Arctic. But I'm saying like initially, it's a little hard to parse out exactly what was happening. But what we do know is that the Arctic small tool tradition, you suddenly find it all across many different parts of the Arctic. Later on, you have forest culture, 2650 to 2550 years ago. Some of these are traditions that we know from one or two or three sites, some of them from more. This is similar in some ways to Arctic small tool tradition, but some new things going on. One of the most characteristic of them being linear stamped pottery, which you can see here. So this is the kind of thing that I like to share because it kind of goes against some of the assumptions people sometimes have about Alaska Native cultures and communities, right? People oftentimes think of things like basketry or things like that, but like here we have like pottery that people were making as well, right? There's pottery going on. At this point, as far as we can tell, people are predominantly hunting seal, caribou, and birds with projectile points that look like this, but not doing whaling yet. And that's going to be like a key turning point in this kind of story of Northern Alaska is when people start whaling, but we're not there yet. You then move into Norton culture. As far as we know, we're still not whaling. This is about 2,500 to 2,000 years ago, so taking us up to about 0 AD. We see good evidence, though, that people are hunting now seal and walrus and also fishing. Um, but again, probably not whaling. One of the reasons we know that people were probably at this point hunting seal and walrus and things like that and fishing is that the artifacts start to show that a lot more clearly. And so this is kind of a set of different Norton culture artifacts. And one of the things that you'll notice is that we now have a number of like harpoon heads that are very obviously that's what's going on, right? These are not like the kind of like um, chisel point projectiles that you're using to hunt land mammals. These are kind of the barbed harpoons that you're going to use on an animal that's got thick blubber and that you want to like stick that thing in and jab that thing in and have that thing be hard to come out, or that you're, expecting it to swim a long ways after you've projectiled it and you need your point to stick in there while it does that. And so, and that also potentially detachable. You also have bolas that you start to see in this period. So if you're not familiar with the concept, basically small or sometimes not so small stones that are connected to a string, and then you and then toss it, and it like around birds' legs. And yes, all of those were technical descriptions that I was just using. All of those sound effects, and you will be tested on them. Just kidding. Inupiat sites start around 1,950 years ago to about 1,050 years ago. And here you have people clearly, it's from like sites like the Deering site, and you see clearly ringed and bearded seals both being hunted, and walrus and caribou. And one of the things that you see that's really interesting here is this clear pattern of connectedness and connections. Um, you might have this kind of vision of traditional Inupiat communities as these like small little communities like in the middle of this vast tundra, right? Kind of doing their own thing by themselves. But that doesn't really match at this phase of cultural life in the Arctic, what's going on at all. Instead, what we see is huge connections. So for example, you have people picking up starting to use snowshoes, starting to use sleds, starting to use birch bark containers. And we see that with Dene groups at this time period. And we also see that with what appear to be Inupiat cultural tradition, which we believe to not be same thing. And so you have this like kind of sharing across presumably language boundaries, right? What you also see, though, that I think is even more interesting, is you see beautiful forms of artwork that we'll talk about in a second, and you see it in the what is now Alaskan communities, and you also see it out on Chukotka, out on the Siberian Peninsula. And so for artwork to look almost the exact same and be on the Alaskan side and on the Russian side, and for that to happen far later, from what we can tell, than people moved into Alaska, tells us a very important thing, which is that those groups still had communication and going back and forth across the Bering Sea and were interacting with each other and like sharing art forms and sharing artistic traditions and artistic ideas. So these groups of people in Siberia and in northern Alaska, they were connected, right? Despite there being the Bering Sea between them. It obviously gets very narrow in some areas, and clearly people were going back and forth even at this time, early time period, and interacting with each other. By the way, about 1000 AD, you suddenly have a century where we like don't get archaeological sites up there, which is strange, but also not that uncommon in Alaska. These are a variety of different kind of Upiatek era artworks and Norton artworks, and so which are kind of like overlapping terms. We don't really need to get into that for the purposes of this class. This is not like an in-depth archaeology class, but just know that this is kind of like this roughly 1000 years ago and a little bit earlier, kind of like artistic traditions. And you see a lot of really cool things here. Um, one of the ones I like. Um, this one. Um, the figure of a young walrus ornamented with a skeleton design and a boss on each hip. This design suggests the carving represents a guardian spirit. Judging from its location, excavation, it was probably sewed to the shoulder of a shaman's garment. So that was the anthropologist's interpretation. Whether or not that is the case, it is very difficult to determine the meaning of an artistic artifact like that 2000 years detached from it. You can look to how similar symbolism is used now in cultures in that area, but as you can imagine, across 2000 years, any cultural tradition evolves and changes and develops new ways of doing art in that time period. So it's going to be difficult. I find this one really fascinating, and I like to have people kind of take a guess at what it is. The anthropologist that wrote the caption is interpreting it as a human figure sea otter. So they're kind of getting at this idea with a few of these captions of sort of transformation, and or the idea either of shamans, spiritual practitioners of like transforming into different kinds of beings or communicating with different kinds of beings. Either way, kind of shamans as operating at the boundary of the animal world and the human world. And that's kind of very characteristic of Inuit shamanistic traditions, traditionally, where there's very much kind of intermediaries. So in certain practices, traditionally, you had shamans that would go into trance and go on this like spiritual journey down to the bottom of the ocean and interact with important spirits down there, such as Sedna, and therefore be able to kind of like plead for their people and make sure that the people still have the sea mammals that they need to hunt. So there's kind of these shamans as these like intermediary figures between animal world and human world. Burenic is from about 1500 to 1000 years ago, a name we use for a series of different sites that you can see pointed out here on St. Lawrence Island and in Alaska and a little bit in Siberia. At this point, diet appears to be over 50% seals, and we see this like proliferation of not just harpoons, but now like signs of nets, signs of like sinker weights, things like that. Again, bolas, whalebone homes, that was a huge thing. We suddenly are starting to see the kind of homes that are going to match very closely to what eventually Europeans encounter when they first encounter Inupiat people, right? These kind of like whalebone homes that are then stretched over with sod and things like that. And again, there's very clear interactions with the Punic tradition over here in Chukotka. So once again, all this interconnection. These are kind of what homes looked like. These are not really like whalebone homes. This is more like using a wooden apparatus, although you could use whalebones for it, and sometimes there are whalebones, as you can see in this picture. But basically, homes during this time period appear to have been semi-subterranean, meaning they are built partially into the ground and just one room and arc so different than like some of those traditional Dena'ina homes we looked at before. And Arctic entry, meaning basically you enter and then you go down and then you go back up to get into the home. There's like this little like dip passageway to get in, which makes a lot of sense if you think about the way that hot air works. So since hot air rises, one of the effects of having an Arctic entry is that you essentially trap the cold air down below and the warmer air up top. So it's handy in that way, among other ways. This is a driftwood frame with corner posts, plank floor, horizontal wads, and then you would cover the whole thing in sod, right? Which would be really, really good for insulation, among other things. By 1000 AD to 1800 AD, then we have a group of sites that we refer to as Thule tradition. Um, at this point, this Thule now spreads across coastal Alaska, across Canada, across Greenland, and so we see this really clear like spread of Thule culture. Whether or not it is a new group of people or a new or just a further development in the culture is something that, again, I'm not an archaeologist, but from what I understand, there's been some back and forth on kind of what that dynamic is there. Either way, whether this is a new group of people moving in and then building on things like Björnik and Norton that came before them, or whether it's the same group of people that are just developing new ways of doing things that are radically different. We do have this kind of 1000 AD, like this is a really characteristic tradition of like Thule, and we know that this is like, okay, these are the folks that are going to directly relate to and be the ancestors of Inupiat people that we know today. Okay. And so these are kind of traditional homes. Again, semi-subterranean, square main room, enter through a tunnel, usually on the south side. Again, makes sense. Raised sleeping benches, log floors, and often using like whale bones as support, or if not, then like driftwood and other things. It's the tundra, so wood is going to be a somewhat scarce commodity, not like unheard of, obviously, but like less abundant than like an interior forest. And so a lot of times using like driftwood as your source of wood. These Thule homes had like gut windows where it's exactly what it sounds like, stretched out gut, that allows you to be semi-transparent and see through. And so, which is very interesting. These in Inupiat, these kinds of homes are traditionally called igloos. And now you're saying, I thought an igloo was like that dome ice thing that I've seen in a million different pictures and cartoons and different things over the years. Um, Igloo and it essentially just means like home, and so it can refer to a lot of different kinds of homes. What we call often in English an igloo is a kind of temporary ice structure that, from what I have seen, and you get different stories from different like oral histories from different people, different elders from back in the day. My read on it, looking at different sources, is essentially that there were sometimes those like ice dome structures built, particularly for like if you're out on a hunting trip and you're going to be out for like a couple of weeks or something, right? You're not going to build like a whole new house, but you also want something like more stable than like a tent, and also you want something that'll trap the heat in really well. So igloos, in their sense of like a snow dome, but igloos is really just a term for like any Inuit home. And the much more common Inuit home was not ice homes, as you would imagine. You don't live all year in an ice home. That doesn't make any sense. But instead, people, their year-round house would have been this, right? Something out of whalebone, something out of wood. These are just a few sources. Credit to Diane Hansen. Any misinterpretations are my own, but Diane Hansen, our archaeologist emeritus, she has some great insight into this tradition, and so I'm drawing in part on images and concepts from her own presentation, and then also drawing a lot on Tremaine's piece, the Deming Flint Complex of Northern Alaska. All right, I'm going to pause here.